Empire at War's modding scene has always allowed you to play in a wide, diverse group of settings, as long as you take wide and diverse to mean fairly narrow and limited. If you want to play in the Galactic Civil War, you have mods like Awakening of the Rebellion and Remake. If you want to play in the Clone Wars, you have Republic at War and Fall of the Republic. And if you want to play in the post-Endor period, you can use Thrawn's Revenge, Age of Legends, or Phoenix Rising. But what if you don't want to do one of those and you want to do something else? What if you don't even like Star Wars? Well, first, I'm not sure why you bought Empire at War in that case, but for a long time, Empire at War mods have had a pretty big hole when it comes to settings outside of Star Wars. Or even just covering other periods of Star Wars, whether that's the sequel trilogy or getting fleshed out mods in the Knights of the Old Republic period. That's not to say there's been none. We do have a couple great ones like Stargate Pegasus Chronicles, which I've played a few times here on the channel, and Halo Campaign Commander, but even in those cases, for example Halo Campaign Commander, it's solely a ground skirmish mod. So why is the Empire at War modding community so dominated by that specific set of subject matter? If we start by going back to before the game was launched in late 2005 to early 2006, large modding projects were announced pretty regularly, and there were several which started work on assets before they could even put them in the game. These tended to actually cover a fairly wide variety of settings, and it was rare for them to overlap with each other in what they were doing. You had the Star Wars mods covering the major eras, like the Legacy of War mod, which covered from the Galactic Civil War to the Yuuzhan Vong era, and you had Imperial Assault 2, which was actually a Clone Wars mod. But beyond that, there was a Knights of the Old Republic era mod called Ages of Star Wars, a few from other sci-fi franchises, and even a couple more based on original ideas, including Project Mars Destination and Dawn of Victory, which was created by Mark, who now runs the Templin Institute YouTube channel, meaning I've known him way too long. Over time, these expanded even further into other franchises. A lot of websites built around covering Empire at War mods from the time, particularly Empire at War files, are gone by now, but several of these projects are still up on Mod Database, and some of the old news from that period is there too. The list of mods for Empire at War, as opposed to Forces of Corruption on Mod Database, is a fair bit shorter, but it's a lot more diverse, and I think this is something you can also see if you go to some other games which are similar to Empire at War. Sins of a Solar Empire is probably the closest comparison, and it even came out around the same time. It has mods covering Stargate, Star Wars, Mass Effect, EVE, Halo, and more. But unlike with Empire at War, a lot of these made it into a reasonably playable state. If you look at the older Total War games, you also have a wider variety of settings available there than what Empire at War tends to offer. So the big question then is, why is that? I think there's a few somewhat interconnected reasons for this. The first element is probably the simplest, and I would say the least impactful. It's a Star Wars game, so it attracted Star Wars fans. There's an element of truth to this, but since Mod Database and Steam Workshop are littered with mods which never really went the distance, it can't just be a complete lack of appeal. By the same token, it can be difficult for one person to make a whole mod by themselves if no one wants to jump on board. My best advice to anyone looking to start a project would be to make sure you're able and willing to do all the necessary things to make at least a sort of playable project on your own, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't really consider when they are starting these projects. Often, even today, I'll see someone float an idea, even something really broad like, I want to make a Halo mod, then they'll take no steps to learn what they need to do to make that happen, and they'll sometimes get upset when people aren't lining up to make it for them. This is always a bit of a factor, but the nature of Empire at War can make this an even bigger hurdle than in, say, Sins of a Solar Empire. In Sins, a faction's unit roster is typically a bit larger for space, but Empire at War needs assets for ground as well, and skilled infantry artists, especially animators, have always been a scarce resource, which is a big stumbling block if you want to make a comprehensive mod for Empire at War. So often you'll see some of these mods get halfway through creating something resembling a playable build, but because they haven't really set themselves up to make something at least playable to iterate on, rather than tackling everything at once, projects do tend to start to fall apart. This can even happen with some of the larger teams which work for years without being able to get something out, because they're attempting to make everything fit their definition of perfect all at once, which is the biggest enemy to anyone ever trying to release a mod. A lot of mod communities will start off with people who have little to no experience experimenting, and they'll grow a talent pool out of that. Empire at War today, and even a bit at the beginning, had a lot of really skilled people doing a lot of interesting things, but there were a few factors, especially early on, which, and this may be a controversial take, stunted some of that development. The earliest mods were fairly slow going because there were a few people learning a lot of new skills to create assets, but one event pretty clearly defined basically the first half decade of what people would be playing in released mods. The models from the Warlords mod for Homeworld 2 were free released for anyone to be able to use in Empire at War, and suddenly there was less of a reason for people to need to learn how to model or texture. If you wanted to make a mod in some other time period or universe, you needed to do a lot of legwork to set it up. But if you just wanted to make a mod, and you were okay with doing something set in the Clone Wars or Galactic Civil War or even post-Endor, you had a lot of assets already available. This was a huge help to a lot of teams, and allowed a bunch of mods to be made really quickly, but it also turned a bit of community sentiment against larger mods, which were taking longer than some of the pure asset flips were. After all, if these new unit add-ons were working with Warlord assets and could release dozens of units in the space of a few weeks, leaving aside how poorly some of them were rigged, why had those older mods not released a full playable version in the year or more that people had been waiting? So with that question on a lot of people's minds, and a lot of the assets being available determining what people were able to work on in a reasonable amount of time, some of the longer standing projects started to just stop production. Rather than having people want to join and help an existing mod go faster, they'd get tired of waiting and start their own asset flip. Whether those were Warlords models, or as became increasingly more common, porting assets from other Star Wars games, something which was generally less possible for other franchises with a less prolific history of games to pull from. The origins of Empire at War Expanded are in this direction as well. I was originally just a fan of the Legacy of War mod I mentioned earlier. I had no idea what modding was or how mods were made, to the point that I was confused about why Legacy of War didn't release on the day Empire at War itself was released. I eventually wanted to make my own mod, planning to just add Thrawn as a hero, since he was only added to the official game once Forces of Corruption came out. But I started talking to some other people, Zerteron and Videotech, about the three of us just trying to add as many Warlords models as possible, to create our own set of mods covering every era since we had been waiting so long for some of these other mods to come out. We pretty quickly decided we wanted to make our own assets rather than using the Warlords models, but there were a lot of mods which started with our idea and continued down that road. This doesn't make any of them bad mods, but it does mean when there were a lot of groups going in that direction, what was available in Warlords shaped what people thought they'd be capable of doing. Beyond the pure asset flips, some really interesting mods did come from this starting position, including some of which that are popular today. But eventually most mods established this way managed to hang on because of their own approaches to gameplay, and they also went in the direction of making their own models. Other mostly freelance modelers like Warp Null contributed a lot of additional models to the community, especially on ground, so there were at least some new assets filtering in pretty regularly, but it often became a race for add-on mods to be the first to incorporate most of them. There was an intermediary period which I would very loosely define as being from 2010 to 2015, where a lot of the more established mods really went back to making their own assets as new people started to figure out the tools, and I think this really took off again around 2017, as the Steam patches breathed a new life into the community which had started to wane somewhat. And even more recently, tools like the Blender plugin, which is a modeling program that's entirely open source, allow even more people to get in on creating their own mods. Unfortunately, a lot of the non-Star Wars mods never got the same boost. The momentum tended to stay with the already existing Star Wars mods. There's a Mass Effect mod, for example, which started as a large asset port, pulling models from the Mass Effect games in the style of some of the original Warlords model conversion add-on mods, but it somehow managed to do an even worse job of it. I don't know that there's really a solution to this. I'm not even sure that it's a problem per se. It's just a thing that I've always thought was kind of interesting, that there's such a big amount of Star Wars mods for the game, and so little even compared to other games that have similar modability. But if you're interested in seeing a wider variety of mods out there, there are a few options open to you. One is of course to start your own mod and learn some of the basics if you really want to see something get done. But another option is to check out and give feedback to some of the still existing ones, or maybe even learn some of those skills and either make a personal edit of some of those existing mods or join up and try to help complete them. Farseer, the developer of Halo Campaign Commander, which I have contributed some assets to myself in the past, has been posting some new screenshots of Space Mode and a Galactic Conquest map, so that could be a mod to keep an eye on as well. As I've said before, I'm also a big fan of Stargate Pegasus Chronicles, which does have a lot of neat stuff to try and which is updated fairly consistently, and there's a third big one to try which does exist, and that's a Star Trek mod, Star Trek Alliance, made by the developer of the Star Wars Alliance mods. All that being said, let me know in the comments if there's a specific universe you wish Empire at War would have a fully fleshed out mod based on. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.